In 1940, Mr. Zweig, one of the most important Austrian novelists, went to Brazil. His idea at that time was to understand exactly what was Brazil in the middle of that decade. By the end of the decade, Mr. Zweig brought one book that was very important for us, Brazilians. Brazil, the land of the future. What we intend to do today is to really understand and analyze what is Brazil today, because it's really very complex to understand. And from a social, economic, and productivity point of view, we're going to try to understand what is happening with the main country of Latin America nowadays. In 2010, Brazil achieved an amazing 7.5% GDP growth. What happened at that time? What was happening with the country that during the last 3 decades was seen with a huge of problems, with a strange pendulum through populism, intervention actions, and liberalization models. Nowadays, the main banks in the world are saying that Brazil will be the 5th largest nation in the world by far in 2030. But the problem is, when the think tanks takes in account other factors such as productivity, such as corruption, such as labor market structure, Brazil is not well positioned. So what happened? Who is right? Who is wrong? How do we assess the really features of Brazil in order to understand if this is the best country to do investments? And at this point, we want to bring the before mentioned framework in order to understand if Brazil is exactly the best country to invest. Our point of view here is not a static view, but actually a sustainable a framework that can give us a sustainable way to understand the Brazilian economy. First of all, if we come back to 1994, we're going to remember that the real plan brought the monthly inflation in Brazil from 50 to 1%, merely 1%, which for a Latin American country, it's something astonishing. In 1999, the same president, Mr. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, brought what we call the economic tripod. First of all, the Brazil put in action what we call the floating FX rate. Let's respect the market forces. We cannot manage the effects of a sustainable country. Second, the fiscal responsibility law. Now we have to manage very well our fiscal accounts in order to provide a sustainable growth in the future. And finally, the inflation target. We really have to maintain the inflation in a low level in order to compete, in order to generate income, in order to increase the purchase power of our population. These 3 elements, well managed during 15 years, brought what was very important to the country. Brought growth, brought low inflation, and in the end, brought what was very important at that time, budget. For the first time in our history, we had the chance to have budget to invest. And the decision should be high quality education, infrastructure, or other things. And the current government decided for other things. Decided to attack the poverty, the inequality. During the last 15 years, Brazil basically tried to increase the wages and the social benefits year after year, as well as increase the level of credit in the market through the public banks, not in a natural way. And finally, the government increased year by year its expenses, its expenditures. The combination of these 3 elements was amazing. 40 million people came out of poverty to the middle class, to the beginning of the middle class. But, on the other hand, those 3 elements combined brought what was very dangerous for the Brazilian economy, inflation. And as you can see here, the current inflation of Brazil would be around 8%, which is very high for a country like Brazil nowadays. But what the government decided to do, on the other hand, was to start to do some unconventional actions in order to bring down our inflation. And for example, using gasoline cap prices, we are maintaining the inflation in a good level. Well, is this right? It could be right if the productivity increased at the same pace. So let's try to understand what is happening with the productivity in Brazil. First of all, we don't have a lot to offer in terms of FDI outflows. Brazil is not competitive. The main multinationals of Brazil are not competitive. That's why Brazil only ranks 30th in terms of FDI outflows. But, on the other hand, we are seeing a huge increase of FDI's inflows. So how come? how a country such as Brazil, with those problems that we just mentioned before, can increase so high and can demand so much money to its country? Well, let's try to understand if this is possible. Why investors would come to Brazil if our infrastructure is lagging behind? If we compare Brazil with its main peers, Brazil is lagging behind a lot. At the same time, if we analyze the level of education in Brazil, we're going to see that the education quality is one of the worst in the world. And despite the fact that the Brazilian students are traveling and studying abroad much more than in the past, the quality of our students abroad, it's not being allocated in the best ways. Why? Because we're basically focusing the undergrad and not doctorate or postdoctorate. So what happened? How $57 billion per year can come to Brazil, being, again, the 7th largest in the world, and we have a bizarre legal and regulatory framework. How can we do this if we have one of the most costs in terms of bureaucracy in the world? How could we do this if we have these crazy corruption schemes in a country such as Brazil? It's really very difficult to understand. But, on the other hand, we cannot deny that the features of the country changed a lot. Labor market became much more close to developing countries. At the same time, we saw the informal labor market decreasing, which is amazing if, again, the government did not intervene as we did in the past, when the wages increased much, much higher than the inflation, which of course was amazing. It brought population to work, it increased the power of consumption, which in the end resulted on a very low unemployment rate, which is artificial as a consequence of all measures taken by the Brazilian government. But see what happened with the unit labor cost. Brazil is losing competitiveness. But the question is, if we are so bad in terms of competitiveness, why investors are coming? What is the rationale? And the point is, Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world in terms of area and in terms of population. It's the 7th largest economy in the world. Brazil, at the same time, only has 7% of its economy depending on agriculture. So just pay attention how much is allocated to service and manufacturing. At the same time, schooling penetration is increasing. On top of that, the middle class increased by almost 50 million people during the last 10 years. We have more 50 million people consuming in an economy that they were not consuming 10 years ago. Additionally, we have an economy that benefits from demographic boom, as well as a society that is demanding more and more service. So size matters. The point is this sustainable? Or we can do this only for a couple of years because of size? The question is, in the end, why Brazil is suffering this problem? We can grow in a certain period, but then we cannot grow anymore. We can control inflation, but then we cannot control anymore. It's basically because we're stuck in the middle. We're stuck in a cycle that basically makes the government intervene in the economy every single time that we have a problem in the world, as we did between 2008 and 2014. What's the consequence of this? Of course, it's the fact that we cannot anymore compete in the same pace as the multinationals compete, because we're creating distortions. We don't have the right environment to do business in Brazil as the multinationals has outside Brazil. How do we solve this? Simple to solve this. Simple to analyze this. We have a problem in terms of wages and employment. We have very high wages, very low number of people working. If we brought more labor, more flexible labor laws, if we brought more investments in higher education, we will be able to reduce this problem, to solve this problem. On the other hand, we also have to work in productivity. We have to implement an agenda to invest more in infrastructure. We have to be more competitive in costs. And with all of this combined, Brazil would be able to implement some other reforms that combined will make money available in a cheaper level, which again can allow the country to invest much more and to grow much faster. So how can we bring that agenda in place? How can we set up this? 2014 we have elections. Currently, the Labour Party is on the government. They are proposing the same agenda. social intervention, people outside poverty, but no sustainable foundations. On the other side, we have the Social Democrat Party, which is proposing the economic tripod that was installed in the 90s. Is it possible to happen? Well, unfortunately, this is not what the banks are thinking right now. JP Morgan just announced it last week that they are not expecting any major rupture, any major change if Brazil elects one or the other. So unfortunately, size matters, and we are big enough to compete. We are big enough to grow. But on the other hand, we are not sustainable. Zweig was right. He was totally right. Brazil is the country of the future. What this very famous novelist forgot to write is, we will always be. Thank you.